38, Willow Island Disaster. Hey y'all, I'm Heather and this is Poisoned Appalachia, the dark side of Appalachia. As always, thank you for listening. I hope you had a great Easter. My mom's been in the hospital and discharged to a nursing home for therapy for a few weeks, so this Easter was a little different, but still good. I hope you enjoyed last week's episode. I love learning about all the spooky, magical things in our area, and cryptids are some of my favorite episodes, so I think that was a fun one. Today I want to talk about something more serious, though, about the Willow Island disaster. This one I've always felt a little connected to. I grew up hearing about it. If you remember my episode on Cheshire, Ohio, I grew up in the shadow of 2 electrical power plants. Also, my dad and granddad were in construction, and I feel that kind of brings it closer to home. This happened when I was less than 2 years old, so of course I don't remember it happening at the time, but I do remember hearing about it a lot when I grew up, and because of the reasons I mentioned, and also because it was in Ohio, and really not that far from where I lived, and still live. Living on the Ohio River, there are a bunch of coal-powered power plants. It's just kind of a part of life, to be honest. As I mentioned before, I'm not a big fan of coal and all that stuff, just because of the pollution they cause, but they're a large part of people's livelihoods around here, and they provide electricity that we need, so it is what it is. But during the 1970s, many coal power plants were being built into the valley along the Ohio River. The Allegheny Power System was building another larger plant at Willow Island, which would have 2 electric generators with a total capacity of 1,300 megawatts. This was in addition to 2 smaller units that were already installed there. By April 1978, one of the draft cooling towers had been built, and a second one was under construction. One of the contractors, New Jersey-based Research Cottrell, was well known for the constructing of such towers around the country. The usual method of scaffold construction has the base of the scaffold built on the ground, with the top being built higher to keep up with the height of the tower. The scaffolding on Willow Island cooling tower was bolted to the structure, and it was an innovative way that was faster and used less supplies, which means spends less money. So that's always a good thing for the contractors. A layer of concrete was poured, and then after the concrete forms were removed, the scaffolding was raised and bolted onto the next section. Cranes atop the scaffolding raised buckets of concrete. 1 5-foot lift of concrete was poured each day. The company's plan was so new and innovative that they wouldn't keep the plans on site for fear that someone would steal them. But they had scaffolding on the jacks that would lift the layer of concrete and not all the way to the ground. They would do 5 feet of concrete a day, like I said, let it set overnight, and then add the next layer. It was late April when this occurred, but like most Aprils, there are cold days and rainy days, and the day before it was really cold and rainy, and concrete doesn't like to set under those conditions. What may have taken 20 hours on a warm day could take much longer on a day like that. On April 27, 1978, tower number 2 had reached a height of 166 feet. Just before 10 a.m., the previous day's concrete started to collapse under the weight of the scaffolding of the construction workers. Concrete and scaffolding began to unwrap from the top tower, first peeling counterclockwise, then in both directions. A jumble of concrete, wooden forms, metal scaffolding, and construction workers fell into the hollow center of the tower. All 51 construction workers on the scaffold fell to their deaths. Coal power plants are not the same as nuclear power plants, which I assume most of you know, but I just want to clarify. However, both types of plants use cooling towers. A hyperboloid cooling tower was patented by the Dutch engineer Frederik van Iderson and Gerald Kuipers in the Netherlands, August 16, 1916. The first hyperboloid reinforced concrete cooling towers were built in the Dutch state mine Emma in 1918 in Heerlen. Hyperboloid cooling towers are the ones that we're most familiar with. They're the ones that are narrow in the middle and wider on the tops and bottoms, sort of like an hourglass shape, but wider in the middle. Industrial cooling towers can be used to remove heat from various sources such as machinery, heated processed material. The primary use of large industrial cooling towers is to remove the heat absorbed in the circulating cooling water systems used in power plants, petroleum refineries, petrochemical plants, natural gas processing plants, food processing plants, semiconductor plants, and for the other industrial facilities such as in condensers, distillation columns for cooling liquid and crystallization, etc. If the same plant had no cooling tower and used the once-through cooling water, it would require about 100,000 cubic meters an hour. A large cooling water intake typically kills millions of fish and larvae annually, as the organisms are impinged on the intake screens. A large amount of water would have to be continuously returned into the ocean, lake, or river from which it was obtained and continuously resupplied to the plant. Furthermore, discharging large amounts of hot water may raise the temperature of the receiving river or lake to an unacceptable level for local ecosystems. Elevated water temperature can kill fish and other aquatic organisms, or can cause an increase in undesirable organisms such as invasive species of zebra mussels or algae. A cooling tower serves to dissipate the heat into the atmosphere instead, so that the wind and air diffusion spreads the heat over a much larger area than hot water can distribute heat in the body of water. Evaporate cooling water cannot be used for subsequent purposes other than rain somewhere, whereas surface-only cooling water can be reused. So basically, the coal power plants generate electricity by burning coal to heat water, creating steam that spins a turbine connected to a generator, which then produces electricity. But to cool all that down after it's been used, it goes through the cooling tower so that the water can cool and not be detrimental to the land and rivers. Me being the nerd here, I'd really like to see the whole process, kind of. Like the whole process, how electricity is made. I think it'd be kind of neat to see, but I digress. Let's get back to Willow Island. Willow Island, West Virginia is in Pleasants County, not too far from Parkersburg, West Virginia, and Marietta, Ohio. From where I live, it's probably about an hour and a half away or so not too far. I think I've been through there before, but maybe just once, and I don't really remember it. This is probably why. Right near Willow Island is the town of St. Mary's, and St. Mary's had a bridge that was identical to the Silver Bridge that fell in Point Pleasant. It never had any trouble, but they tore it down after the bridge fell so as not to have another disaster. And I remember my mom telling me that story as we drove through the area, so I've technically been there, but didn't know it at the time, I guess. Willow Island is just a tiny place. According to Wikipedia, Willow Island is an unincorporated community in Pleasants County, West Virginia, United States, not Ohio. I don't know why I said that. Willow Island is located on the Ohio River at the junction of West Virginia Route 2 and County Route 10, 3 miles west-southwest of Belmont, West Virginia. Willow Island has a post office, which opened on October 17, 1946, and closed May 25, 1991. The Pleasants Power Station site of the 1978 Willow Island disaster is located in Willow Island. This is the location of Willow Island Baptist Church and Willow Island Cemetery, the burial site for many of the area's founding and prominent families. Willow Island was also the location of Cinnamid, later called Cytec Industries. It's a chemical plant and large contributor to the Pleasants County school system and area workforce. The whole area isn't really big. It's like the largest towns in the area are Parkersburg, West Virginia, and Marietta, Ohio. Parkersburg has 29,000 people and Marietta 13,000. So together, right around 35,000 people. Or 45,000 people. So it's not a big area at all. And like I said, Willow Island is tiny. So most of the people that were working there were either known by everyone or related in that small town. Not that that makes any better or worse, really. Just it makes it harder on the town because almost everybody lost somebody. Or multiple somebodies in this case. Obviously, a big construction project like that means lots of jobs in the area, which is generally a good thing. That is until something like this happens. The reason I'm bringing it up is because one family lost 11 members. How devastating. The victims included a handful of supervisors who came to the project from out of state, but most were local construction workers. Pleasants County became the focus of national media attention as grieving families buried their dead. One family counted 4 or 5 sons, a brother, 2 brother-in-laws, and 3 nephews among those killed. Willow Island's first cooling tower had been finished in August 1977 with no problems. The system was innovative and was thought to be something that would revitalize the industry. I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, instead of using scaffolding that went from the ground, they had a system using scaffolding that would move up as the layers of concrete moved up. Then they did about 5 feet a day. This would set overnight and be ready for the next level. The system was so world-changing that they wouldn't even keep the plans on site for fear that someone from another company would steal them. Not keeping plans on site doesn't really sound like that good of an idea to me. Turns out it probably wasn't. The New Jersey company building the plant, Research Cottrell, had a good track record, no disasters or major accidents. They were a well-thought-of company. As we all know, the month of April can be warm or cold, sunny or cloudy, rain or snow. It runs the gamut. I mean, today, who knows, tomorrow could be completely different. So on this April morning, it had been cold and rainy the night before, and that morning was cold and damp. I mentioned that they would lay the 5 feet of concrete a day, and it was set overnight, and then add the next layer. Because of the cold and the dampness, the concrete hadn't set well overnight. On the chilly morning of April 27, concrete workers form carpenters and steelworkers were on the scaffold system at the second tower. An elaborate complex system that moved up as the tower rose in height. Sections of the scaffold had been bolted to the concrete on the sloping wall of the cooling tower. Concrete that had been poured just 20 hours earlier in near freezing temperatures, according to a report a year later by accident investigators. The concrete not quite set wouldn't have been that much of a problem, but there were so many other things that happened. Reports estimated the insufficiently cured concrete had a compressive strength of 220 pounds per square inch, where the required mechanical strength to support the construction of higher tower sections would be calculated to be more than 1,000 pounds per square inch. In any case, the builders should have planned to provide a safety factor or two in their design, meaning they should have let the supporting concrete on the lower portion of the tower cure until its compressive strength was over 2,000 psi. A crane that was set up had a cable break and it snapped into the scaffolding on the concrete form from the day before. This began where the crane was situated, but as scaffolding and concrete fell inward, it pulled scaffolding down and concrete from all around. About 10 a.m., supports began to pull loose from the wall, quickly followed by more and more until the entire ribbon of concrete unspooled from the wall. Witnesses and investigators said that it began falling from both sides, so even though some of the workers were running to escape, there was really no way for them to get off in time. The concrete and scaffolding began to unwrap from the top tower, first peeling counterclockwise, then in both directions. A jumble of concrete, wooden forms, metal scaffolding, and construction workers fell into the hollow center of the tower. All 51 construction workers on the scaffold fell to their deaths. Of course, people on the ground had no way of knowing all the workers were dead. The first thing I heard was concrete falling. John Peppier, a worker on the ground, told the New York Times in 1978. I looked over my left shoulder and I could see it falling. I could see people falling through the air and everything falling. They just started dropping like dominoes, he said. Another worker on the ground near the tower who helped in the rescue effort told reporters, I looked and it was gone. The scaffolding was just gone. Workers on the ground started rescue operations immediately. Other workers began digging through the steel and concrete debris. Fire departments from Belmont, Parkersburg, Vienna, and St. Mary's in West Virginia and Marietta in Ohio were called in. Ambulances from Parkersburg and Marietta hospitals were also dispatched. The volunteer fire department in Belmont was turned into a temporary morgue. Many of the men could only be identified by the contents of their pockets. All but one worker were identified by co-workers. I saw on a video that a surgeon was called in to be on standby, and unfortunately he didn't even get one patient. So it's so sad. Willow Island ended up being the deadliest construction-related accident in the history of the United States. So what exactly, other than the uncured concrete, caused the disaster? According to the website NoonPie, this is some of the things that they had listed. Use of concrete with insufficient compressive strength, which I mentioned. The builders used concrete to support the scaffolding system on the cooling tower, but began subjecting it to the load of tower construction, including the dynamic loads of hoisting operations only 18 hours after it had been poured. Other than the use of the concrete with insufficient compressive strength, there was also missing bolts, or bolts that were too weak for the load. The traditional method of construction was to base the scaffolding on the ground and building it up to keep it with the height of the structure, but the building and plan of Willow Island was to bolt the scaffolding required to each higher section to the tower to the concrete tower structure below, which I had mentioned earlier. The investigation by OSHA after the disaster found that there were bolts missing from the scaffolding, which also supported the crane that collapsed, and that the bolts used had insufficient strength to secure the scaffolding to the concrete. Moving the anchor point for the static line. The hoisting system for lifting concrete to construct higher portions of the tower uses a static line from the load to the ground. The static line keeps the load from swinging, and by requiring an extra pulley for routing, the line assists in lifting and reducing the mechanical force needed to raise the load. The static line runs through an anchor point into the ground, from which it is pulled to lift the load. Initially, the anchor point was close to the base of the tower, i.e. the static line was nearly vertical, but was moved for construction convenience away from the wall to the center of the cooling tower, creating a side force from the gantry that helped collapse the tower. The subsequent accident report notes, if the base anchor point of the static line had been kept at its previous location before the last move to near the center of the tower, the effects of the construction loads would have not reduced to such an extent that the failure of lift 28 of the tower would probably not have occurred. No person or group was responsible for the safety of the site. The construction plan was to support the construction equipment, which included concrete forms for higher sections of the tower, lifts for raising concrete, and the workmen on the already built lower sections of the wall. However, the builders never specified either how long the concrete sections had to cure or how much tested strength was required before the work could begin on the higher sections of the tower. Although a testing company on site performed mechanical tests on the concrete, nothing in their contract would seem to indicate that they would have any authority to shut down the job if they found problems. As reported by Governor's Commission, the Commission further reported there was no inspectors or supervisors of any kind on the job whose responsibility it was to check the work to make the determination either to proceed with the work or give the concrete more time to gain strength. Lack of training for the construction workers. The builders provided no training in what for many construction workers was a new kind of construction system. Using already constructed sections of the tower to support higher scaffolding was common on steel frame buildings, but relatively uncommon on concrete buildings. The Governor's Commission commented that because of the word-of-mouth training that is a natural part of the work environment, and because there were no written specifications available to reference, workers could inadvertently make gradual modifications that might compromise the design and cause conditions beyond the limitations of materials. Some of the inadvertent modifications that helped cause the collapse include the moving of the anchor point and the static line, as the tensions of various loads helped maintain the strength of the scaffolding. The Federal Occupation Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, leveled fines against 3 construction companies involved in the project, charging negligence. A federal grand jury heard evidence in the case but returned no criminal indictments. Of course they didn't. Why would they? Always looking out for the companies. There were multiple investigations after the disaster. The Governor's Commission focused on the safety culture, noting the lack of worker training as well as the lack of management and technical supervision. An investigation by OSHA identified mistakes in construction technique, particularly emphasizing that the concrete was not allowed to cure and the bolts securing the scaffolding were too weak. On June 8, 1978, OSHA issued the construction company a knowing and intentional violation of safety practices citation for failure to make field tests on field-cured concrete specimens to ensure the concrete had attained sufficient strength to safely support the load prior to removal of the forms. The citation was settled for $83,000. That's about $1,700 per worker, which is quite frankly BS in my opinion. A human's life is worth way more than $1,700. Just ridiculous. All of the companies continued working after that, but Research Cottrell were bought out in the 1980s. In 2012, First Energy Corporation, the parent company of Monongalia Power, announced plans to close the Pleasance Power Station, along with 2 other coal-fired plants in Albright, Preston County, and Rivesville, Marion County. The Willow Island plant was originally scheduled to close on January 1st, 2019. However, the state legislature passed an act signed by Governor Jim Justice to provide First Energy with $12.5 million per year in tax breaks in exchange for keeping it open. First Energy closed the plant on June 1st, 2023. However, it reopened with Quantum Pleasance on August 31st, 2023. Willow Island was the worst non-mining disaster in West Virginia history and one of the deadliest construction accidents in U.S. history. It also was another in a string of tragedies that had plagued West Virginia for more than a decade. In just over 10 years, the national media repeatedly returned to West Virginia to cover tragedies like the Silver Bridge collapse, Farmington mine disaster, Marshall football team crash, Buffalo Creek flood, and Willow Island. I want to take a minute to mention those lives lost in a disaster. Sometimes I don't do this, but there's 51 of them. I just feel like we should mention them. Joseph V. Bafile, Washington, Pennsylvania. James B. Blower, St. Mary's. Robert W. Blower, St. Mary's. Steve D. Blower, St. Mary's. Kenneth E. Boring, Salem. Richard Bowser, Parkersburg. Thomas Cross, St. Mary's. William Cunningham, Parkersburg. Roy Deem, Waverly. Ray Duelli, Glenville. Darrell Glover, Moundsville. Lauren K. Glover, Moundsville. Alvin W. Goff, Tuppers Plains, Ohio. Gary Gossett from Walker. James A. Harrison, Parkersburg. Claude J. Hendrickson, St. Mary's. Daniel Hensler, Newport, Ohio. Kenneth Hill, Midland, Pennsylvania. Roger Hunt, Parkersburg. Tom Captis, Cairo. C. Randy Lothar, St. Mary's, Ronald Lee Masters, Walker, Howard R. McBrayer, Jr., St. Mary's, Willard H. McCown, Pennsboro, Clayton Paul Monroe, Parkersburg, Robert Moore, Flatwoods, Chet Payne, St. Mary's, Edgar A. Phillips, Marietta, Ohio, Raymond Poling, Thornton, Robert C. Riley, Parkersburg, Ray Rawlison, Pennsboro, Floyd Roop, Dexter, Ohio, Alan Sampson, Parkersburg, Glenn Satterfield, St. Mary's, Jeff Snyder, Vienna, Ernest Steele, St. Mary's, Emmett Steele, St. Mary's, Larry Steele, St. Mary's, Miles Steele, St. Mary's, Ronald Steele, St. Mary's, Richard Stoke, Waverly, Richard Swick, Beverly, Ohio, Brian Taylor, St. Mary's, Dale Martin Wagner, Bellington, Charles Warren, Parkersburg, Jackie Westfall, Newport, Ohio, Louis Wildman, Stouts Mills, Ronald Yoakum, Parkersburg, Gary Hinkle, Parkersburg, Larry Dean, Parkersburg, and Fred Pride, St. Mary's. So, it's quite a lot of people with similar names, unfortunately. A similar incident occurred in China in 2016. The Finchang Power Station collapse occurred on November 24, 2016. At least 74 people died and at least 2 others were injured and trapped after a construction platform at a power plant in the Chinese city of Finchang in Jingji province collapsed. During that time, more than 60 people were working on the platform and another dozen were on the ground waiting to begin their shift at 7 a.m. when the platform of the power plant's cooling tower under construction collapsed. So, sad that it happened again, unfortunately. I don't really want to speak about China because I don't know, but I assume their standards for OSHA probably, or whatever their equivalent of OSHA is, probably isn't as good as the United States. But even with the United States OSHA, look what happened. So it can happen anywhere. So there's a memorial there at Willow Island built in 2000. It's in the shape of a cooling tower and has the name of those lost in the collapse on it. The memorial is 18 miles north of Parkersburg, West Virginia on State Route 2. It's 5 miles south of St. Mary's. Also on State Route 2, it's open year-round, free of charge. A picnic table and benches are on site. There's not a lot to do other than that at Willow Island. But in the area, there's a lot. Marietta is about 20 miles away, and it's full of history. According to Ohio.org, Marietta is a charming town located at the confluence of the Ohio and Muskingum rivers, with a rich history dating back centuries. Marietta is full of interesting museums, historical sites. Downtown Marietta is home to a variety of local shops and restaurants, making a perfect place to spend a day exploring. And no visit to Marietta would be complete without taking a scenic riverboat ride down the Ohio River. Whether you're looking for a historic experience or just a fun day out, Marietta has something for everyone. Settled in 1788, Marietta was the first settlement in the Northwest Territory and is the oldest city in Ohio. The Hopewell and Dean of Native American cultures were the earliest visitors, arriving more than 2,000 years ago. With centuries of history, there's plenty of historical sites and museums to explore in Marietta. With its riverside location and close proximity to Ohio's only national forest, outdoor enthusiasts will love exploring the many miles of trails and recreation activities available in the area. The walkable downtown area is a perfect place for a stroll to admire historic architecture and to support local businesses. There's no shortage of shopping in downtown Marietta, with plenty of locally owned shops and boutiques. From antiques, primitives, and home decor to food, specialty, and apparel, you'll always find one-of-a-kind treasures in downtown Marietta. I've been to Marietta a lot, and I think it's a really cute town. I would definitely recommend it. Also, across the river from Marietta is the Parkersburg area, and there's a lot to do there, too. The City of Parkersburg website says, whether you're a history buff or an outdoor enthusiast or just love shopping for antiques, Parkersburg is the perfect place to get away. Its convenient riverfront location offers great access to boating and water sports in the Ohio River, as well as nearby lakes. Hiking, biking, kayaking, rock climbing, ziplining, and geocaching are also nearby. As one of West Virginia's most historic sites, Parkersburg and the surrounding areas features a colorful and fascinating heritage This has been magnificently preserved and presented by our museums and historic sites. In addition, the city is home to the authentic Sternwheeler that offers regular tours to the majestic Ohio River to Blennerhassett Island Historical State Park and the beautifully recreated and authentically furnished Blennerhassett Mansion. And the city is home to one of West Virginia's largest historical residential districts. The city is filled year-round with festivals and events like the nationally recognized Parkersburg Half Marathon, the TOP, a heralded premier wine and food tasting event, antique car shows, festivals, and more. And music and theatrical showcases in venues like downtown's Point Park and the historical Smoot Theater. Blennerhassett is something that I think is pretty cool. It's the Ohio River's most famous island. Blennerhassett lies 2 miles west of Parkersburg. It's 4 miles long, and its 381 acres make it the river's 5th largest island. Blennerhassett was created sometime after AD 1300 when the river cut an additional channel north of the main channel. Located on a major stream furnishing food, water, and transportation, the islands invited human settlement. Prehistoric Indians occupied the island until about 1680. They eventually cleared most of it to grow corn and lived in villages and structures covered with reed mats or bark. 20th century excavations have revealed Blennerhassett Island to be one of the region's richest archaeological sites. Blennerhassett's recorded history begins with a mention of 1765 journal of the Indian trader George Croghan. The 1766 traveler noted that the Delaware chief Nemacolin's cabin on the island, which for that reason was called Nemacolin's Island, in following years. It was known as the Belpre Island. The island was farmed by New Englanders during the Ohio Valley 1791-95 Indian War. They erected 2 blockhouses for protection, transforming the island into a business center by building a store and 2 floating grist mills. The island's most momentous chapter occurred with the 1798 arrival of Harman and Margaret Blennerhassett, wealthy Irish aristocrats fleeing political persecution and personal scandal. Their years on the island, while brief, were charged with excitement and high style. The couple's mansion gained the reputation of the West's most beautiful home. In 1805-06, they allowed their estate to become headquarters for Aaron Burr's military expedition to the southwest, an episode that raised the island to national renown and awarded it a permanent footnote in U.S. history. Eventually, it became the subject of a short story by Nathaniel Hawthorne, a poem by Walt Whitman, paintings of Eastern artists, and 2 New York operas. The Blennerhassetts fled the island when Burr's scheme collapsed. I think I might have to do a story about this. Sounds kind of interesting. I don't really know that much about it. But despite its notoriety, Blennerhassett Island led a sleepy farming existence until 1886, when a park which lasted through 1912 was built on the upper end. The boxer Gentleman Jim Corbett competed at the park, as did the Cincinnati Reds, Brooklyn Dodgers, and Pittsburgh Pirates. As a 1920s moonshining center, Blennerhassett Island became the scene of occasional raids and bloody frays during Prohibition. Today, Blennerhassett Island is a state historic park with the reconstructed Blennerhassett Mansion providing an elegant backdrop. The island welcomes 40,000 visitors a year. The Blennerhassett Island Historic District was added to the National Registry of Historic Places in 1972. Tours are offered when the park is open from May through the last weekend of October. Mansion by Candlelight is a premier event for 2 nights only in October. Other special events are offered throughout the year. You should definitely check it out. So that's about it for today's episode. As always, thank you for listening. You can follow me on social media under Poison Appalachia. I'm on Instagram, Facebook, Threads, Lemonade, TikTok, Blue Sky, and YouTube. If you could, on the podcast platform that you listen to, could you please like and rate me and share me, please? Let everyone know about my podcast. Just share. Thanks, and have a great week, y'all.